Hello and welcome to a comparison of the Supernova to the reality on both a house and sport pattern with Angel and James. The Supernova is actually closer to the reality than it is to the Proton physics or the gem, in our opinion, so this is where we're going to start. Other comparisons will be coming soon. Angel will be comparing them on the house shot, and James will be comparing them on both the house shot and our regular sport pattern. Quick refresher on the Super with Angel, it's a stronger Nova with more torque. It doesn't actually have more torque, of course, they have the same core, but the extra traction from the cover takes more advantage of the available torque than the original does. The Nova is much more of a stable and tumbly but cleaner kind of control ball, and the Super takes that idea and supercharges it. It has an above average amount of length and shape for a ball of this strength. She can either walk it down the side or get it back with power from deep. It's just a ridiculously versatile ball. Moving on to the reality, and as odd as it sounds, the reality is actually a little earlier and more forward. The reality is one of the longest and sharpest hook monsters ever. I have it up there with the Sherlock in that regard, but the Super is even a bit longer, of similar friction response, a bit more tumbly, and more continuous. The reality is still pretty special, but the Super, in our opinion, takes the idea of the reality and improves it. The Super doesn't tend to cut so sharply, it doesn't straighten out, and while it's about the same friction response again as the reality, the tumble keeps it from cutting or being too sharp or driving by back row pins. Angel's reality is tamer than most that I've seen from a shape perspective. Mine is pretty whippy, and so is James, for a strong sanded ball, of course, but Angel's is more balanced. Bowling balls won't always do the same things for different people. This is why you use different balls with different attributes to balance your game with the ball reaction to produce the desired outcome. Back to the Super for a couple quick shots. It's very reminiscent of the reality. They look and act fairly similar. I think that the major difference is that the reality wants to be more dynamic. It has a little Ricky Bobby in it. It just wants to go fast. Even though the Super is more dynamic than the original Nova, it still leans more into that overall stability. Where the reality is just overall too much for Angel, it fits great for people who maybe have a lower rev rate and or higher speed than she does. Moving to James on the house shot, when you take the length and pop of something like the reality and harness it with the controlled tumble of the Nova, you get lightning in a bottle with the Super. I don't really even have to talk here. This is one of the dumbest looks you're ever going to see for anyone. It's highlight reel stuff that's exactly how people dream their ideal ball reaction up in their heads. Now, to pull it back a little, that doesn't necessarily mean this ball is for you. However, it's amazingly versatile for Angel especially. James can get anything to cover boards, but it's the happy medium he needed between something like a reality and the Nova. He gets a lot of use out of his Nova. With as high of a rev rate and speed as he has, he needs control. He doesn't need his power magnified. He needs it, again, harnessed and made efficient. The Nova is sometimes not enough ball, though. Even though it's asymmetric, the cover formula itself is only medium strength. Sometimes it doesn't have the traction for him. On the flip side, something like the Gem is just too much too early, and while it offers the stability and blend he needs, it's too aggressive, just too much strength to produce good ball reaction for him unless he's on a flood. This has put the reality in the perfect place for him. He's got more traction and punch than with the Nova, but not the amount of strength of the Gem. Now, at the same time, it's a little too clean and torquey sometimes. The traction and boom on the back end gives him something to work with, but again, it wants to fly. It's a good solid look, but for him to be able to even further refine that idea with something that pulls that balance back towards the Nova a little, that's where things click. The reality is right on top of the Super from a strength, length, and friction response zone. Very, very familiar reactions. It's just that once the reality winds up, it goes. It almost accelerates on the back end. If you have James' speed but Angel's rev rate, reality is an obvious GOAT level choice. However, if you need that amount of traction but don't need that amount of overall shape and drive, the Super is probably the better option. Let's check them out on the sport pattern now. I'll pop the graph up here. Medium length at 42 feet, 28.4 mils, so pretty heavy, just over a 2-to-1 ratio, so very flat and difficult. This is footage from the Super that we haven't seen yet. Box surface for the Super is 2,000. His didn't come anywhere close to that, so it went to 3,000 for the house footage, but we did go to 2,000 before we got on this pattern. The Super, despite being controllable and tumbly, is still on the clean and responsive side for a hook monster, and when you're on a pattern like this, you don't want clean and responsive, especially if you're James, you want strength and stability. Despite his layout slowing the response down a little, going pin down does also raise the RG, so the layout makes the ball smoother, but it also makes it longer or easier down the lane, so it adds friction response control, but you sacrifice a little mid lane control. On the sport pattern, even at 2000, it's still a little longer and jumpier than he'd like. This is beyond perfect for someone with less power because the fight is always for that hook and shape balance. If you have a lower rev rate on a pattern like this, you most often find yourself trapped in something very strong with a lot of surface and you just have to sacrifice the shape. Even if you're in something like a reality, most of the time it's still just a bit too much shape. You have to sandblast it to rein it back in a little bit, and it can be tough to find that traction and shape balance. With the Super, I think that if you don't have the power James does, it's that perfect balance. It's the right amount of traction with the right amount of shape. Looking at the reality now, James has a quite different layout on it, and this is to control it and slow it down some. Fairly long pin to pap and PSA to pap, this really tames it down, but he still goes stronger on the pin buffer, so he doesn't completely neuter it. However, you can see that even then it's still on the same wavelength as the Super. It's not quite the right look either. It still wants to be somewhat clean and responsive. Moving in and away from the oil on the gutter improves the look for both balls. The problem is that this isn't where you want to start or play generally on the fresh for this pattern, specifically because you saw the problem with the Super. It's flatter in here, so it's harder to get it down the lane, and if you give it the room to get down the lane, it's a very short trip to giving it too much room. On something like this, James isn't likely to be in an asymmetric ball at all unless it's something a little tamer like the Nova. I do have a very interesting comparison coming soon where we look at the Super versus the Nova on house and sport. Keep a lookout for that one. I think the Super is going to be more at home on house patterns for bowlers like James and sport patterns for bowlers like Angel. They've both used it in league already. It's a touch stronger than Angel prefers. It's definitely usable, but depending on the league and who we're bowling against, it's either great or a bit too much. For James, he does need to keep a little surface on it for league, surprisingly. We do have an above average volume house shot, but again, NEX is surprisingly clean and responsive for how much it actually hooks. Coming soon, we'll have the Super versus the Gem in addition to several others because despite being a solid quote-unquote hook monster, it's in reality territory, so it does get into the space of something like an Infinite PhysiX or a Reality Check or a Dark Code. Big shout out and thanks to my Patreon members and great Discord community. Thank you for watching, and may the strikes be with you.